all started with a fatal car crash outside a Kentucky nightclub. One night, a car went off Licking Pike in Wilder, Kentucky, and slammed into a telephone pole right in front of Bobby Mackey's Music World. Officer Larry Hornsby was one of the first people to arrive, and by the time he stepped out of his cruiser and walked over to the wreck, it was already clear there wasn't anyone left to save. While he was there at the scene, he happened to look back toward the nightclub and noticed a woman walking in his direction. She was wearing an evening gown and carrying several white tablecloths folded over one arm. Without saying much, she handed them to him. Hornsby took them without thinking twice. They were exactly what he needed to cover the victims, and as far as he was concerned, she'd simply come from the nightclub, seen the accident, and brought something that could help. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. About a week later, he went back to Bobby Mackey's. He wanted to return the tablecloths and thank the woman who had given them to him, so he walked inside and asked if anyone knew who she was. No one knew who he was talking about. At first, Hornsby figured there had to be some misunderstanding. But then he was told the nightclub had been closed that night. The doors had been locked, and no one should have been inside. By the time Larry Hornsby had that experience, Bobby Mackey's had already been collecting stories like that for years. But when Bobby Mackey first opened the place in 1978, none of that reputation existed yet. And the person who would eventually become most closely tied to it was a 20-year-old named Carl Lawson. I'm your host, Robert Barber. In 1978, Carl Lawson took a job helping renovate an old nightclub in Wilder, Kentucky. Before long, he was living above it. Then he started telling the owner that strange things were happening after everyone went home. He heard footsteps crossing the empty dance floor. He felt watched, and over time, Carl became convinced that whatever he was experiencing inside the building was getting harder to ignore. This is the story of Carl Lawson, Bobby Mackey's Music World, and how one caretaker's experiences became part of one of the most famous haunting stories in America. And this is State of the Unknown. Bobby Mackey hadn't bought the building because of anything strange that had supposedly happened there. He was a country singer who wanted a place of his own. He'd spent years playing clubs around the Cincinnati area, and by 1978, he had reached the point where he could either head towards Nashville or tried to build something closer to home. He decided to stay. The building he and his wife Janet bought sat on Licking Pike in Wilder, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati. It had been used for different businesses over the years and had most recently been a biker bar, but by the time Bobby got it, the place was empty and needed a lot of work. That's how Carl Lawson entered the story. Carl was 20 years old when he came by during the renovations looking for a job. Bobby hired him to help clean and paint, and Carl apparently proved himself pretty quickly. He stayed on as the work continued, became the club's caretaker and handyman, and eventually moved into a small living space above the nightclub. When Bobby Mackey's Music World opened later that year, Carl was there for the whole routine. During the day, there was maintenance to do and things to repair. At night, the building filled with customers, country music, and people coming and going. Then closing time came, everybody left, and Carl stayed behind. That's when he said things started happening. At first, what Carl described wasn't especially elaborate. He talked about hearing noises in the building after everyone was gone. And he said there were nights where he could hear footsteps moving across the empty dance floor below him. He also started getting the feeling that somebody was watching him. The basement bothered him too. There were parts of the lower level where Carl said he felt especially uneasy, and eventually he tried talking to Bobby about what he thought was going on. Bobby wasn't interested. It wasn't necessarily that he had an explanation for what Carl was hearing. He just had a much more immediate concern. He'd put his money into this nightclub. He was trying to get people through the doors, and he didn't want one of his employees telling customers the building was haunted. So he told Carl not to spread the stories around. Carl seems to have respected that, at least publicly. But whatever he thought was happening didn't stop. He kept living upstairs, and every so often he would tell Bobby about something else he'd heard or experienced. Bobby later remembered that Carl became concerned enough at night to brace the door to his room and keep a shotgun nearby. Up until then, the stories mostly stayed inside Bobby Mackey's. For a while, that was more or less where things stood. Bobby had a nightclub to run. Carl had a building to take care of, and Bobby didn't give much attention to the stories Carl kept bringing him. Then, Janet Mackey started having experiences of her own. Janet had heard what Carl was saying and seems to have taken him more seriously than Bobby did. She later said there were times when she felt uncomfortable inside the building, especially when she was there alone. Then, according to Janet, something happened near one of the stairways. She said she was inside the club by herself when something grabbed or pushed her and sent her down the stairs. After that, Janet reportedly stopped going into the building alone. For Bobby, that was harder to brush aside than anything Carl had told him. Carl had been living in the building for years, hearing noises and talking about footsteps after closing. But Bobby could always chalk that up to one person's impressions. Janet was different. She wasn't sleeping upstairs every night, and she hadn't spent years convincing herself the place was haunted. Whether Bobby believed she'd encountered something paranormal or not, it was another person he trusted telling him that something inside the building hadn't felt right. Now Bobby had two people close to him telling him something strange was happening there. Carl had been saying it for years, and now his wife was describing an experience of her own. Other people eventually began adding stories too. Employees and customers reported noises they couldn't explain, glimpses of figures, or the sense that someone was nearby when they couldn't find anyone there. Carl's reports were changing too. What had started as footsteps, noises, and the feeling of being watched gradually became more specific. Carl began talking about particular presences he believed were inside the building, and one of them was a woman he called Johanna. He said there were times when he could smell rose perfume and believed that meant that she was nearby. He also claimed he communicated with her, and at some point, he said he found a journal that had belonged to her. By then, Carl wasn't just saying something strange was happening at Bobby Mackey's. He was starting to believe that at least some of what he was experiencing had an identity. There was another discovery in the building that would eventually become just as important to the story. During work in the lower levels, Bobby and Carl uncovered an old opening beneath part of the structure. It was some kind of shaft, and over time it came to be described as a well. Bobby seems to have seen it as one more old feature in a building that had been around for decades. Carl became much more interested in it. As his experiences continued, he increasingly connected the basement and eventually that opening with whatever he believed was happening inside the club. Still, most people outside Bobby Mackey's knew very little about any of this. The stories mainly belonged to Carl, Janet, Bobby, and the people around them. That started to change around 1989, when Bobby mentioned Carl's experiences to a friend named Doug Hensley. Hensley was a writer, and when he heard about Carl, he wanted to talk to him. Carl was hesitant at first, which makes sense considering Bobby had spent years telling him not to discuss this stuff publicly. Before Carl agreed to the interviews, he wanted to make sure Bobby was okay with it. This time, Bobby was. Hensley began talking with Carl and with other people connected to the nightclub. He listened to their experiences, started looking into the building's past, and eventually published an early version of the story under the title The Terror at Bobby Mackey's Music World. Up until then, the stories mostly stayed inside Bobby Mackey's. Carl's experiences now had a history being built around them. The woman he called Johanna acquired a much more complete story. According to the version that became associated with the club, Johanna had once been connected to an earlier nightclub on the property. She had supposedly fallen in love with a man her father disapproved of. The man was killed, and Johanna later took her own life. That gave a pass to the woman Carl had believed he had encountered. Then the story reached much further back, to a real murder that had taken place in northern Kentucky in 1896. The victim was Pearl Bryan. Pearl was 22 years old and came from Greencastle, Indiana. She was pregnant when she traveled to the Cincinnati area, and not long afterward, her body was found near Fort Thomas, Kentucky. She had been decapitated. Two men, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling, were convicted of killing her and were eventually executed. Pearl's head was never found, and that missing part of the case helped keep the story alive long after the trial was over. By the time Bobby Mackey's began attracting paranormal attention, Pearl Bryan's murder had become connected to the nightclub. One version said Jackson and Walling had brought Pearl's severed head to the property and thrown it into the old well beneath the building. Other versions added that the men had been involved with an occult or satanic group that used the site for rituals. Those stories changed what the basement meant in Carl's story. The old shaft wasn't just an old shaft anymore. It was being connected to a murder, to ritual activity, and eventually to the idea that something much darker had happened on the property long before Bobby ever bought it. As that larger history grew around Carl's experiences, his own interpretations of them seemed to grow darker too. He no longer believed he was simply sharing a building with unexplained presences. He began to believe some of them were dangerous. By the early 1990s, the story was spreading beyond northern Kentucky. Bobby, Janet, and Carl appeared on television to talk about what they said was happening, including an appearance on the Jerry Springer Show in 1991. More coverage followed, and people who had never set foot inside Bobby Mackey's began hearing about Carl, Johanna, the basement, and the old well. For Bobby, this created a strange situation. He still thought of the place as a country nightclub. That's why he bought it. That was how he made his living, and that was what he wanted people coming there to enjoy. Carl was dealing with something much more personal. He said he was having trouble sleeping and experiencing disturbing dreams. He believed his behavior was changing, and eventually he came to the conclusion that whatever he believed had been affecting him inside Bobby Mackey's was no longer confined to the building. Carl believed something had attached itself to him, and eventually he described it as possession. The people around him took that belief seriously enough that a religious deliverance was arranged, and Carl agreed to participate. The ritual was filmed, and those who were there interpreted Carl's behavior during it as evidence that something was inside him. Carl later said he felt some relief afterward. Carl stayed connected to Bobby Mackey's for years, but his life became more difficult. Later accounts describe him struggling with alcohol, and some people came to believe those problems were connected to what he thought had happened to him inside the club. By then, though, the story had moved far beyond Carl. People were coming to the nightclub specifically because they heard it was haunted, and some of them left with experiences of their own. One of those people was a regular customer named J.R. Costigan. Costigan later said he was washing his hands in the men's restroom when he looked into the mirror and saw what he described as a dark, man-shaped figure wearing a cowboy hat. According to his account, the figure came toward him and attacked him. Costigan said he was hit, kicked, and scratched until he lost consciousness. He believed strongly enough in what happened that he later sued Bobby Mackey. The lawsuit was dismissed. At some point, Bobby Mackey's also put up a sign telling customers that management wasn't responsible for the actions of ghosts or spirits. It was partly a joke, but it also showed just how much the reputation had become part of the place. And sometime during this period, Officer Larry Hornsby responded to the fatal crash outside the club. That's the story we started with. Hornsby said a woman in an evening gown walked toward him from the direction of Bobby Mackey's and handed him white tablecloths to cover the victims. When he returned about a week later to thank her, nobody knew who she was, and he was told the club had been closed and locked that night. His experience became one more account attached to a place that was already collecting them. As more people heard those stories, they wanted to see the building for themselves. Visitors started asking to go downstairs and look at the basement and the old well. At first, those visits were informal, but eventually they turned into organized ghost tours. Bobby never really saw the place the same way Carl did. He remained skeptical about the paranormal stories, but eventually accepted that they'd become part of Bobby Mackey's reputation. By the 2000s, Bobby Mackey's paranormal reputation was firmly established. The TV show Ghost Adventures investigated the club in 2008 and later returned, and other paranormal television shows featured the location as well. By then, people weren't walking into Bobby Mackey's the way Carl had in 1978. Carl had shown up looking for a job, knowing nothing about the stories that would eventually surround the place. Years later, visitors were arriving already familiar with Johanna, Pearl Bryan, the well, and Carl himself. Janet Mackey passed away in 2009. Carl Lawson died in January of 2012. He was just 53 years old. After Carl's death, his photograph remained displayed inside Bobby Mackey's while the club continued operating and the stories continued being told. Then, in 2024, Bobby Mackey's moved out of the old building on Licking Pike. That December, the structure was demolished. Nearly half a century had passed since Carl first showed up looking for work. The building he had lived in was gone, but the story he started telling Bobby all those years earlier wasn't. When you start separating the different pieces of the Bobby Mackey story, one thing becomes pretty clear. Carl's earliest reports were much simpler than the version most people know today. He talked about footsteps, noises, feeling watched, and being uneasy in parts of the building. Bobby later remembered Carl bringing those things up before the nightclub had become nationally known for being haunted. That matters because a lot of the most famous parts of the story came later. Joanna's detailed history is difficult to verify. The journal Carl said he found has never been independently established, and researchers haven't been able to identify a historical woman who cleanly matches the familiar story. The Pearl Bryan connection is even harder to support. Pearl was real. Her 1896 murder was real, and her missing head was never found. But there isn't good historical evidence connecting her murder to the property on Licking Pike or showing that her killers brought her head there. The same is true of the satanic ritual story. That part appears later, and there's no reliable contemporary evidence showing that Pearl's killers belonged to an occult group or used the property for rituals. Even the old shaft beneath the building changed over time in the retelling. It was a real physical feature, but eventually it became a blood well. Then the place where Pearl's head was supposedly thrown, and finally, the so-called portal to hell. So a lot of the history surrounding Bobby Mackey's doesn't hold together nearly as cleanly as the legend makes it seem. But that doesn't make Carl disappear. He was still living above the club. Bobby still remembered him talking about the strange experiences before the larger story took shape. Janet later reported an experience of her own, and Carl seems to have believed what was happening deeply enough that it changed the way he lived inside the building, and eventually the way he understood what was happening to him. There are ordinary possibilities for at least some of what people reported. It was an old building. It had been remodeled repeatedly, and the railroad ran close enough to create noise and vibration. But that only gets us so far. It doesn't tell us what Carl thought he was hearing after closing. It doesn't explain what Janet believed happened to her on the stairway. And it doesn't identify the woman Larry Hornsby said handed him those tablecloths. So after you strip away the parts of the Bobby Mackey legend that don't hold up very well, you're still left with something. Not proof that the building was haunted, just a handful of people who seem to have genuinely believed something happened there. And Carl Lawson was the first person who kept trying to tell Bobby about it. What stayed with me after looking into Bobby Mackey's wasn't really the well or the stories about Pearl Bryan. It was Carl. He was 20 years old when he walked into that building looking for a job. He wasn't looking for ghosts, and he wasn't trying to become part of a legend. He was just a young guy who took a job, moved into a room above the club, and started telling Bobby that strange things were happening after everyone went home. And for a long time, those experiences were mostly his. Then other people started listening. Doug Hensley asked questions. Books were written. Television came in. Tourists started showing up. And eventually, people all over the country knew Carl Lawson's name. But by then, the story had grown far beyond what Carl first described. It had names, murders, rituals, demons, and an entire history wrapped around it. And I kept thinking about what that must have been like for him. To tell people about something you believed happened to you, and then slowly watch that experience become something other people told, interpreted, and added to. Maybe Carl encountered something in that building that he couldn't explain. Maybe some of what happened had ordinary causes. I don't know that we'll ever be able to answer that. But whatever happened to Carl, it seems to have mattered to him. And I think that's the part worth holding on to. Before Bobby Mackey's became a famous haunted nightclub, before the books and the television shows and the ghost tours, there was just a young man living upstairs who kept trying to tell somebody that something strange was happening downstairs. This has been State of the Unknown. Carl Lawson's photograph remained inside Bobby Mackey's after he died, hanging in the same place where his name had become part of the building's history. The old nightclub itself is gone now, but the stories Carl started telling there more than 40 years ago have outlasted the walls that surrounded them. If you've been enjoying these stories, leaving a rating or a review in your podcast app really does help more people find the show. On Spotify, it's just a tap of the stars. On Apple Podcasts, you can even leave a short written review. I read them and I appreciate every one. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next story, just hit follow in your podcast app so it shows up automatically when it drops. Until then, stay curious. Because if you ever hear footsteps after everyone else has gone home, just remember, that's how Carl's story started too.